Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Michael Viega, Communications Editor for Voices, a World Forum for Music Therapy. Welcome to another edition of Voices Interviews, where we interview authors from our latest edition and dig a little deeper into their research and their work. These interviews can be found archived on our Voices YouTube page, as well as on our Padlet. Padlet is an online post-it board where you, the reader, can find videos, you can find the articles, and you can also engage with them and give comments, share an artistic creation response to what you're reading, ask questions. It is a space for readers and authors to uh, be together and dig a little deeper. So check out our Padlet. The link for the Padlet is in the description of this video. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Hiro, author of the Impact Areas Questionnaire, a music therapy service evaluation tool. This article was co-written with Netta Spiro, Owen Coggins, and Ania Zubala. Dr. Hiro Siri is a senior lecturer in music therapy at Queen Margaret University and the arts lead at St. Columba's Hospice Care in Edinburgh, Scotland. Dr. Giorgos has an extensive background in developing and leading service evaluation and impact measurement projects in music therapy and within the broader areas of arts and health. During his research at Nordoff-Robbins, he coordinated the charity's national service evaluation work and co-authored together with Mercedes Pavlicevic and Camilla Ferrant, the only book in the field which is dedicated on service evaluation for art therapists and for art and health practitioners. His research expertise lies in collaborative and participatory methodologies with an emphasis on practice-led projects utilizing bespoke data collection tools. He is the editor-in-chief of Approaches, an interdisciplinary journal of music therapy, the chair of the ISME Commission of Special Music Education and Music Therapy, and co-chair of the 2022 European Music Therapy Congress, which will take place in Edinburgh. So, without further ado, I'd love to welcome Dr. Hiro Tsiris.
Good evening.
And let's begin with congratulations. This has been a 10-year process for you, actually now 11 years, and starting in 2009. And I was just wondering about your adventure over the past 11 years, the contributors and your own journey. How did this all get started for you?
Oh, yes, it has been a long process, Mike. And really, what I think it's really unique about this process is that we never started this journey by thinking, oh, that's going to be the final output. It really started from a real need within an organization to evaluate their services. So it was a very pragmatic, situation where it related to strategy development, it related to funding requirements, and most importantly, to quality assurance. So it started really from the ground, having partners and other people wanting to engage in a process where we could measure in a way that made sense to the service and to the practice, to measure and document, if you like. Perhaps measure is not the right word, it's more documenting the impact or the perceived impact of music therapy in specific contexts. So we started, and at that time, Actually, at that time, I was a research assistant at Nordoff-Robbins in England and Wales. And together with Professor Mercedes Pavlicevic, who at that time was the director of research at Nordoff-Robbins, we started developing bespoke evaluation tools to start evaluating the services. So that was really the beginning of it. We were called to evaluate the services that we were providing within our premises, but also, and actually the majority of that was with external partners or partner organizations, which could range from a primary school to prisons, to care homes, to mental health units. So it could be, you name it, wherever Nordoff-Robbins was providing services, we would be evaluating.
Resulted in a publication in 2014, which was really the theoretical framework or the grounding of the tool that you're providing. Can you talk about what brought you to that point?
That's right. And actually, Mike, as I was preparing for our chat, I brought it next to me.
There it is.
this little,
Yes.
this little book.
Beautiful. Hold it up for the camera. Let's see it. Yes. A guide to evaluation for art therapy.
And you know what? Again, that was an interesting point. It came actually together with that book. So it was a guide to research ethics and a guide to evaluation.
Beautiful.
And both books, came out of that realization that we were not the only people who were battling with these questions around, how do you go about evaluating a service? And interestingly, in music therapy literature, you find publications around clinical assessment. So, tools around tracing the effectiveness, if you like, of music therapy, of a specific intervention on a client. But you don't get really publications around service evaluation, which is quite a different thing. It has a different scope, it serves a different purpose. So we realized actually that although many practitioners and researchers were battling with similar questions, they were not writing about them. So everybody, was very much focused on their service, on the pragmatics of their context, and trying to do the best that they could do for the service. But the knowledge that they were gaining, it was not really shared with others. So we just thought, it was by no means, that this is the Bible of service evaluation, not at all. It's more of a kind of a reflection of where we were at that stage. And we tried to systematize our thinking with a hope to say to other people and colleagues, say, well, look, this is what we have learned from the process so far, and the things that we think can help you if you're starting similar work. But as I say, it was not it was not communicated, and shouldn't be communicated as kind of the gold standard framework, because really the main message of that book, and still our main message, also the paper that we published in Voices, is the context sensitivity of service evaluation and the importance of having bespoke processes that speak to your practice, that speak to your context. So really these guidelines are more kind of a way, if you like, a guide to help you think about the questions that you may have to answer.
What were some of the motivating factors for you at that time to show that music therapy helps?
Yeah, that's really an important question, Mike. And if I may take a slightly kind of a back step from that, what I have noticed in the field, at least in the UK, but I think I would generalize kind of quite safely that observation to other countries as well, is that what you see is that people, practitioners and organizations very often engage with service evaluation in a more reactive way. So, when you know that, for example, your funding comes towards the end, or that there are cuts, or so very often has to do with funding and proving value, if you like. And very often people do it in a reactive way. And my experience is that these are kind of bad stories, because it usually doesn't end up well. Because if you do it reactively, usually you are quite late to start the process.
Yeah, it feels
And
like it's as if I'm trying to prove that I'm valuable or prove that I'm worth
yeah,
it. Or so it feels kind of disempowering to start from that advantage point.
yes, and it feels very functional in many ways, but in a negative way functional. Like, it doesn't feel that it's done in a way that is, comes from a genuine curiosity, if you like, and willingness to learn and improve the service itself. Is more kind of a tick box exercise. So really, what we tried to do, of course, it was influenced by funding, and the need to prove value, if you like. But what we try to do is to build it as a proactive and embed it as part of practice. That if you're practicing, yes, you do clinical assessment, but you have to consider the service in its context as a service as well. And that was really our key message. And I have to say it was a culture shift, because many practitioners, well, first of all, I think many practitioners are not trained to think in that way. So if you tell me, off you go, you do a service evaluation, some people wouldn't know where to start from, or they wouldn't have a clear kind of understanding of how that relates to audit or to clinical assessment or to different ways or research.
Can you talk
So
about that relationship for a second? Just I am interested where you see the intersection between service evaluation, assessment, clinical assessment, and research. I mean, it does feel like these things often need to intersect and need to be embedded, as you're saying, but often feel fragmented and in silos, and people might value one over the other.
yes, yeah. And I mean, I have to say that, first of all, I don't think there is a common definition and agreement on what the exactly the difference is. And there might be also differences between different countries. But at least in the UK, one way that has helped us to systematize our thinking about these different ways of understanding the practice is that clinical assessment very often has that emphasis on music therapy intervention in relation to a specific client and tracing change over time. So, I'm working with Mike. Mike's profile when we began was X. I'm doing an evaluation or an assessment. 6 months later, I'm trying to see change over time. But that's very much about Mike. Service evaluation takes a step back and says, well, look, yes, your practice and your interventions are part of what you do, but also you do a whole lot of other things. You are accepting referrals. You are part of multidisciplinary team meetings. You are running groups. So you take that step and you see the service as embedded in the organization. And when we typically in service evaluation, you wouldn't be tracing change over time, but very often it's a snapshot evaluation of people's perceived impact of music therapy. So maybe somebody may say, well, yes, my son goes to music therapy, but the perceived impact for me of music therapy in this context is X, Y, Z. So participants, and that comes, with a degree of methodological weakness as well, but participants would be asked to make a degree of generalization based on their own experience of music therapy in that context.
And that's so valuable. I just want to mention, when working with students, for instance, and you're trained as a music therapist in whatever level you're trained in, and you go into a setting often maybe contracted, and how the administration might perceive you is very different from how you perceive what you do. And it's very different for how the people you're working with, maybe the service users, may be perceiving as well. So especially music therapy, because the administrator might say like, oh, fun recreational music time. The service user might be like, oh, I'm going to share my favorite song, and I know that this person, and then the music therapist comes in with an agenda or their own, like, I'm going to help in this way. And so these things can often be feel discongruent and not very connected.
Yes, and actually, when you start asking questions that perhaps you as a practitioner, you may think, well, it's not at the top of my agenda of why I'm here in music therapy, why I'm working here as a music therapist. But once you just start asking these questions, you discover all other potential impacts or unintentional impacts of music therapy in a context. So for example, we have had lots of staff commenting on how music therapy was changing what they call the atmosphere of an organization, and how that motivated them on that particular day to engage with their work. It was influencing the relationships with clients, out with the immediate music therapy context, which would be kind of what we name the ripple effect. And a music therapist wouldn't necessarily say, well, this is why I'm working in this organization. But when you see that kind of bigger picture of what are the forces of influence, and these are mutual as well, because we would ask also the music therapist, what are the things that influence your practice? So you start becoming aware of a more kind of complex whole, which needs to be articulated. Yeah, and also,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and Mike may also add, because we were talking earlier on about service evaluation, clinical assessment, and audit.
Yes.
So just to bring audit also into the discussion, our understanding of audit, it's very much, this is more of a tick box exercise. So basically you say, what do you promise your music therapy service is providing in this context? Okay, you say you will do individual sessions, you will do group sessions, and maybe you'll be attending multidisciplinary meetings. So you have a list of things that you say, I'll be doing this. Audit will be, you come to the annual review, for example, and you say, well, have you done one-to-one sessions? Tick. Have you done group? But you're not assessing quality very often. Audit is more, have you done what you've promised you'll do? But usually they don't attribute value. But again, that's a generalization, how audits, clinical assessments, service evaluations happen in different contexts can vary.
And often probably get blended in. So it's nice to understand that there are the boundaries between them and how they can work with each other and to better the services
Yeah.
provided all around more holistically. Um, I'm interested in how you and the co-authors kind of moved from 2014 to 2019, and maybe discuss the co-author's involvement and your involvement in the findings that you have shared with us in the Impact Areas Questionnaire, and how that came about from 2014 to now.
Yes, so in this 5 or 6 year period, lots happened. So when 2014 publication of that book came out, we were still very much developing bespoke evaluation tools for every single service. But within our context, what we realized that we had some standard or similar questions that were kept repeating in different projects. So what we did, we took a step back and said, okay, let's bring all the projects we've done together, all the tools that we have designed, and see any emerging patterns. And this is what led really to the first versions of the Impact Areas Questionnaire. It was a questionnaire that was summarizing the key questions that felt kind of relevant across all the services that we were evaluating, and also that were relevant in relation to our strategy as an organization. Because very often, you would try to link, if you like, the outcomes with what was the strategic direction of the organization. So some of the language that would be used, they would be aligned in that way. So we had designed the first version of the Impact Areas Questionnaire, but what we had realized through presenting to colleagues and sharing the work is that many people were worried that this is a very much specific Nordoff-Robbins tool, and it's not really applicable to other settings. Things were happening, life gets in the way or leads the way. I left from Nordoff-Robbins, England and Wales, and some months later, or a year perhaps later, I took a new post as the head of research for Nordoff-Robbins Scotland. Now, what is worth perhaps clarifying for everybody, Nordoff-Robbins England and Wales and Nordoff-Robbins in Scotland were sister charities.
Ah. Hmm.
But they were different charities at that time. But more recently, after the completion of our project, actually, they merged and they became one charity. So nowadays, as we speak, there are one charity. It's Nordoff-Robbins UK.
Okay.
But when the project happened, there were two separate charities. But of course, they were sharing uh, their ethos to an extent. So they were sharing things. They were sister charities, but they were different. So when I moved to Nordoff-Robbins in Scotland, there was no evaluation framework for the charity. And the obvious place for me to start with my colleagues in the sister charity was like, well, look, we have done all this work over the years. Perhaps this is a golden opportunity for us to see if in a similar enough organization that we share some of the values and the ethos would make sense as a tool. So we start checking basically its transferability and applicability in a different context, which was similar yet different. So this is how the whole
Yeah.
project emerged, really.
I was right. I'm glad you brought that up because I was wondering how it moved from a Nordoff-Robbins context into something that seems to be applicable across models and across approaches. That you have these domain areas related to physical experience and communication experience and the social experience that feels more broad than perhaps certainly a Nordoff-Robbins model that might see music as the primary domain. And so, yeah, I was wondering how it moved from that context into a larger context.
Yes, I mean, we always thought that music was at the core of all the domains, although there were some specific impact areas that were about experiencing music or music making. But yes, actually, for example, for us, although we have seen that it did make sense to transfer it to a different context, uh, I would personally be still very curious to have perhaps a future study from another organization, maybe in a different country, or an organization which is not Nordoff-Robbins. Because although we did check transferability in a different Nordoff-Robbins organization, they were still Nordoff-Robbins. So
Right.
some of the denominators were shared, although there were some differences. But I would be curious actually if in other
Neurologic music
institutions,
therapy
yes,
or
yeah,
medical setting. Yeah.
yeah, and see, what would make sense to them and how perhaps they would adapt this tool. And they may say, well, for us didn't work, or we had to make substantial changes. But I think it would be a very interesting process. And as one of the developers of the Impact Areas Questionnaire, I would be fascinated to see how that translates or not in different contexts.
Why do people not really publish in scholarly areas and journals results related to service evaluation? Like we rarely get a chance to share and see articles related to service evaluation tools and even see results related to them. Your literature review is very thorough, and we have seen some interesting ones related to some arts-based methodologies, sharing administrators' perspectives, but never so ecological. And oftentimes we see little bits and pieces of the ecology, but this really brings together the ecology. Why is it so rare? Why do we often see the assessments and the clinical intervention research, et cetera, but not so much evaluation, service evaluation?
Um, I I can only kind of guess in many ways, from my knowledge of the literature and also speaking with colleagues. So, so my understanding is really that practitioners commonly perceive that clinical assessment is part of the responsibility to be working in an evidence-based way. And so I think clinical assessment, if you like, sits within their professional identity very clearly. And so also because it's an expectation, then if you publish about that, you feel that you contribute to the knowledge base. And on the other hand, you get research studies that usually they have research funding driving them. You have the expertise of a researcher that will talk about methodology. And I think then you have service evaluation that's, I think sometimes people don't know what to do with it because, you know, very often it's perceived as an add-on or an external expectation. Like it
And
doesn't come
acting
naturally from a professional
reactively.
identity.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And people do it reactively. So very often it's done in a way that people are not happy with it. And they're not excited necessarily about it, or they don't see it as something that could truly inform and give them new knowledge about their practice. It's more kind of a tick box exercise because it has to be done. And I truly think that's a missed opportunity because so many people have struggled with service evaluation. They have collated outcomes. They've never seen the light of publications. And they really talk about the problems and the nuts and bolts of, you know, what happened in your organization. And I totally understand the limitations or in terms of generalizability and all of that for service evaluation. I totally get it, but I don't think that's a good enough reason for not to be published.
It really feels like that, you know, the questionnaire that you created, the Impact Areas Questionnaire, looks to look at the ripple effect and the ecology, and that it helps in a lot of ways the context within other areas because it gets other people to consider, well, what are the other ecological, what is the ripple effect here? And the ripple effect will look very differently whether it's in a school or whether it's in a community center or whether it's in a medical hospital, whether it's in a behavioral health psychiatric facility. The indirect beneficiaries that you discuss will change, and who you might have to expand the Impact Areas Questionnaire. What would you say to other clinicians watching and say, no, you know, like I feel like that this would be really beneficial for where I'm at. Where should I start with the Impact Areas Questionnaire? Am I able to adjust it meeting my needs, or how could this help where I'm at right now?
What we always do when we do service evaluation is to spend lots of time on planning. Many times people think that the most time-consuming kind of phase, if you like, in the evaluation process is like collecting and analyzing the data. And my experience is actually quite different. I would say that sometimes, I would say probably two-fifths of the time, it's well spent on planning. And planning would include mapping, if you like, your service, trying to take a step back and realize and document and map out what are you doing as part of your service, or perhaps what you should be doing and perhaps you're not doing, because it's not only what you're doing, but perhaps what you would be expected or you should be doing, or what's the potential. So I would start from there. I would start with some kind of planning. And when I say planning, that includes, if you like, your network, where you're situated, which might be very practical things like, who is the closest department within the organization. But also it has to do with human resources. Who in the organization can support you to do your service evaluation, but also what data you may already have that could be used for service evaluation. So many times people think that you always have to generate new data. And of course, new data is important, but very often we have lots of information already, could be, depending of course on consent and permissions, but you might be able to use case study material that you have, or you may have from the patient record system data that pertains to attendance to music therapy or cancellation reasons. So for example, in a school environment, you might see that there are clear patterns why sessions get canceled. And this does not necessarily require new data to be generated, but it requires a system for you to make sense of data, existing data retrospectively. So in the planning, I would think of, where is your service situated, but then also what are the human resources and what is the data already available around you.
What do you mean by distributed? When you talk about distributed impact, is this what you mean a little? And not just the data that you're bringing in, but also thinking about the network in which you're in and how the data will impact multiple different areas of what you're working in.
Yes. So the idea of distributed impact comes from that assumption that music therapy has an impact,
Right.
to begin with. And of course, it has its shortcomings as well, because and me and my co-authors also, we had lots of discussions about that, because it's not that linear. It's not cause and effect like music therapy does something to people. It's much more kind of complex within the ecology, and there are more reciprocal relationships in there. But for the sake of clarity within the service evaluation, we use the word impact, which was actually more neutral compared to effectiveness, because impact can be also negative.
Right. Yeah.
You can have, or you can have no impact.
And there
So
was some of that in the results as well, in
yeah,
terms of, absolutely.
and I think that's very important to acknowledge in these reports. And sometimes I think music therapists feel quite self-conscious when they say negative impact, and it's like, oh, and they take it sometimes very personally. They want to, justify why it was negative. But we just have to make sense of these things. So if we go beyond that kind of causal, because this is not meant to be causal, but it's kind of the locus of attention. So when you do music therapy, for example, with a child with autism, and the child has been referred to music therapy. Now, this child may be brought to the sessions by a teaching assistant, or by their grandparent or their mother, so this person, these are, if you like, indirect beneficiary or potential beneficiary. They have not necessarily been referred to music therapy, but what happens in music therapy does affect them in one way or another. And this is what we mean by distributed impact, that awareness that music therapy can influence other people who are not referred to the service. And that comes also, with critical questions like that many colleagues of ours have discussed. When does the session start? When you pick up the child, from the corridor, for example, and you walk down
And
to
you're
the music
singing
therapy
as
room.
you're, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oftentimes as you're moving someone from a room and a wheelchair, and they're singing and you're singing, you're going to the group, it's already begun.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or, that person leaves the session and they might be whistling the tune that you are playing,
Exactly.
And this has a knock-on effect on the stuff that is in the chord. So
Again,
we're
the ripple
interested in that
effect.
ecology. Yeah. So this is where the distributed impact concept, what it tries to capture in some ways.
Certainly, many times, you often see caregivers, behavioral health assistants, and who bring people to the group, and they're dancing and singing just as much as the people you're working with are dancing and singing, and to understand the boundaries between who you're helping, who's receiving the help here, to have that broader outlook of what the service provides, and the indirect beneficiaries is so helpful to be able to see.
And Mike, if I give you actually an anecdote of something that happened literally today for me, because what I'm thinking is that, what we're discussing now, it may sound to some people quite philosophical, kind of theoretical,
Right.
But I'm a strong believer that the discourse that we develop should be informed by practice, but also does inform your practice. So for me, doing service evaluation that looks also at the distributed impact has really shaped my practice as a music therapist. So this morning, actually, I was at the hospice where I work, and I was playing live music, with my PP and all that. I was playing live music on the wards. it was not necessarily a music therapy session with a specific person in mind, but I was aware, for example, that there was a woman and her son in this room. I was aware of staff walking by, and I was trying, if you like, to capture this or reflect, if you like, the soundtrack of what was happening. Now, I was told that at the end of the day, as I was leaving, the receptionist at the hospice stopped me and said, "You know what? This woman's son. So this woman is at the end of her life, and her son, as he was leaving the building, stopped at the receptionist and said, 'You won't believe it. When the song stopped or the piano playing stopped, my mom, who is nearly at the end of her life, raised her hands and hand clapped.' I didn't hear the hand clap because it was very soft, but for me, it
Beautiful.
was a beautiful kind of, uh, if you like, case where something happened in that room. I was not in the room, I was in the corridor. It affected that relationship, which obviously was very important. And I'm pretty sure that this moment will stay. This moment will stay with
It will
this,
stay, of course. Yeah.
as some kind of legacy of that moment with his mom at the end of her life. But then also had a ripple effect on the receptionist, who told me, "Oh, I felt so touched myself just listening the story." So none of us actually witnessed what happened, but we were all part, either at some kind of synchronicity, where at the same time part of what was happening, but also it was beyond the time event. That this story, then the story itself carried on in the organization and influenced the receptionist, and then the receptionist felt that she had to tell me. So it's kind of a beautiful kind of, I think, just a little anecdote of how what we do is always embedded in a bigger ecology. Yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel is important to bring up before we?
Um, there are two brief things that
Yeah.
are in my mind. One is that I know many people, music therapists, work part-time in organizations. They have very limited time. They might be contracted in several different locations and organizations. And doing service evaluation can be a real challenge, not in terms of the skills, but in terms of the time investment and the support that you have. And many times people feel that if you are not employed by a music therapy organization or service provider, um, it's not your job to do the service evaluation. And I would really like to invite people to reconsider that position, because I think you as a practitioner, negotiating contracts, negotiating also your place within a multidisciplinary team, I see service evaluation being a very powerful tool for you to navigate these pathways and also learn about your practice. So it's not specific to people who are employed by organizations who are music therapy specific, or they have that research team. And at Nordoff-Robbins, I think we were quite unique in in terms of having a research team which was dedicated to doing service evaluation. But I think our learnings are applicable to individual practitioners as well. So that's one thing. And the other thing, that our tool, the Impact Areas Questionnaire, is not doing, but I think is important for people to keep in mind and see how they can develop that, is the cost effectiveness side of service. For us, it was not the priority because of organizational structures, but for other service providers and practitioners, integrating a component that has to do with cost effectiveness and generally costings of service is an important element.